Now Harper's Magazine editor Louis Lapham. In January, he spoke about social and political shifts in the United States at the Overseas Press Club in New York. His comments last about a half an hour.
Well, we have talked today about students beginning their careers. We've talked about correspondents ending their careers. We've talked about the names A.J. Liebling and I.F. Stone have come up. One of the things I most admire about the profession is it has allowed some people to say what they mean and to stand by it, to live by it. Louis Lapham, editor of Harper's, was described in yesterday's New York Observer as America's favorite grouchy magazine editor. I don't think of him that way. I think of him as an iconoclast. I think of him as a trenchant observer, someone who says exactly what he means and says it extremely well, and someone who provokes me, and sometimes elucidates, sometimes provokes. But I think that's the very best tradition of American journalism. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Louis Lapham.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I see many friends in the room, and I'm sorry I didn't get the piece out of Mr. Frank. But I thought I was going to come and talk to a very small lunch and tell old stories about the days when I was a foreign correspondent and so forth. But Bill persuaded me to talk about the new American ruling class, which is a subject to which and how does journalism fit into the new order. So I'm not a Marxist and I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not even a grouch, but I know that the word class arouses suspicion and uneasiness in an American audience, and I have no objection to a ruling class. No country can exist without a ruling class. That was true in Rome in the first century. That was true in the United States in 1787. That was true in Britain at the zenith of empire, and it's true now. So the only question in my mind is what kind of a ruling class, what's its nature, what's the character, and what's its worth made to what specifications, and with what passions or objectives in mind. And it seems to me that the American ruling class or governing class or possessing class, whatever you want to call it, my favorite term for it is equestrian class, because that is an old Roman term. The rank was for sale for 400,000 sesterces in Rome in the first century AD, and the governing class in America it's a rank that is for sale. That's also always been true in the United States. But something has happened to that class over the last 50 years, I think. I think it is no longer a specifically American class. I think it's lost its interest in politics, and I don't think it has much use for an intelligent press. And you now will ask me, who are we talking about? And the figures vary, and numbers of other writers have written on this subject. Bill Greider's written about it, Kevin Phillips, Christopher Lasch, Michael Lind. Essentially what we're talking about is the 1 or 2% of the American population that owns 90% of the nation's wealth and 75% of its capital assets. It's an oligarchy. It's not a large percentage, but it's a fairly large absolute number. I mean, maybe we're talking about 2 million people, perhaps. Essentially, these are the people who write the laws, who write the news, who run the schools, direct the corporations, own the media, and own the banks. The rich and the servants of the rich. Michael Lind, in his book that he published last summer called The American Nation, refers to what he calls the donor party. The donor party is the group of no more than 200,000 people in the United States who give political campaign gifts in excess of $5,000. To become a candidate, you must be first elected by the donor party. That is the beginning and end of the American democracy. It's 200,000 people. Because if you don't have money, you don't, unless you're Steve Forbes or Perot, you don't even appear on television. Another way of describing the oligarchy or the equestrian class would be to just think of the shoppers on Madison Avenue or Rodeo Drive, or the residents of the zip code section in New York, New York 10021, which is this narrow golden rectangle in the city of Manhattan, where the annual income is something like $2 billion a year income within that one zip code section. Another way to think of it would be the way that the public broadcasting network thinks of it, which is, I did a book show on television for a couple of years for PBS, and there, the PBS number, which is like the Harper's number, for the total universe of Americans that makes the market for the trade list of the New York Times, books, for magazines like Harper's, The New Yorker, Foreign Affairs, for the documentaries that appear on PBS, for most of the leading policy journals and so forth. We're talking about no more than 2 million people, if that many. That's the whole universe. Now, the people that essentially live within that universe, run the schools, own the banks, write the laws, and so forth, it's the view from the box seats. And the first thing that's changed in the last 50 years is the sense of responsibility. I believe, maybe I'm a romantic, but I do believe that 50 years ago, this class felt some degree of responsibility toward the lower orders. There was a sense that privilege entailed obligation. The attitude was derived in part from the attitude of the British ruling class, the late part of the 19th century, from whom the Americans picked up the white man's burden in the direction of Rudyard Kipling, who wrote that poem, as a matter of fact, as a campaign speech for Teddy Roosevelt. But that attitude is also confirmed by the American victories in World War II. And I happen to have been thinking a great deal about this subject lately because I am writing a book about the social and intellectual history of Yale University over the second half of the American century, 1950 to the year 2000. The American century, as you know, is a phrase coined by Henry Luce, Yale, 1919, former chairman of the Yale Daily News, and so forth. And the whole sense of American empire, American primacy, American supremacy, American obligation is very much in place at Yale in the 1950s, which is when I was there as an undergraduate. And several of the professors in both the English department and the history department were recruiters for the CIA. The sense that of a noble mission of bringing the light to a darkened world, the careers was very much part of the milieu. And Yale then, as Yale now, is in the business of making the American equestrian class. That is why one pays $26,000, $27,000 a year to send a child to either Yale, Harvard, Princeton, or the other universities that do this sort of thing. The people in the 50s identified themselves with an American Commonwealth. There was an American ideal. There was an American idea. There was a sense of obligation. I don't think that the current kids, the ones that I know at New Haven, or our current oligarchy has the same feeling at all. I think that the members of the American equestrian class today inclined to think of themselves as align themselves with an international economic order rather than an American Commonwealth. There's very little patriotism in this among the people that I'm talking about. They have more in common with their peers, their economic peers, in England, Japan, or Germany than they do with the run-of-the-mill Americans in Omaha or Sioux City. And you see it in the character of somebody like Richard Nixon, who was very much at home with the Shah of Iran or Ferdinand Marcos or Noriega, people of that. Those are the kind of people that he liked, could talk to, understood. Deep fear and hatred of the ordinary American citizen. Corporations, the American corporations today receive much, if not most, of their income from abroad. Coca-Cola now no longer has a domestic division. It's a world company, and so they're not thinking in terms of an American nationalist economics. A lot of this is also obviously true of the movie industry, which without foreign sales cannot afford to pay the kinds of salaries they now pay. It's also true of our banking industries and airlines and so on. So it's an international economic world order, and this is very clear. I sound like Buchanan, but Buchanan is right in this. I don't think this is a matter of opinion. I think this is a matter of sheer statistics. You can see it with NAFTA. You can see it in any number of ways. I saw it most clearly the year that the Challenger exploded. The 6 months after the Challenger exploded, AT&T and GE were called to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee because the Cold War was still going on, and AT&T and GE had decided to send up their newest satellite on a Soviet rocket. It was the only rocket going, and the Foreign Relations Committee took this very seriously and said, you can't do this, this is trading with the enemy and so on, this is our most sophisticated technology and so forth and so on. And the two corporations said, we really don't care what you think, Senator. It's not important because this is about money. And if we don't send it up on the Russian rocket, we're going to lose to the French. We can't afford to lose to the French. And you could make the speech to, your friends at the Council on Foreign Relations, but no and goodbye. Another way of looking at the increasing isolation of the American equestrian order is in the move to the suburbs. That's everybody, a lot of other people have written about that, but we now have a country that is becoming increasingly feudal in its organization. We have, the United States spends $20 billion a year on public law enforcement. That includes all forms of public law enforcement. City, county, sheriffs, FBI, Justice Department, and so forth. We spend $40 billion on private law enforcement. Again, it's the retreat from the public realm, privatization of everything. The private is 50 years ago, the notion of the public sector, the public sphere, the public commonwealth would have connoted a good. Today, in most usages, the word public connotes filth, squalor, incompetence, bad housing, fool politicians, and leaking drains and so forth. And the word private is associated with the clear trout streams of Colorado, and all good things flow from the private sector as opposed to the public sector. That is something that has happened in 50 years. Another way you see the withdrawing is the American sense of humor. 50 years ago, most of the jokes, or many of the jokes, were the have-nots making fun of the haves. This was the humor of Mencken, this was the humor of the movies of the 30s, this was the humor of the New Yorker in the 30s, and so on. Today it's reversed. The humor is the haves making fun of the have-nots. It's the humor of the David Letterman show, it's the humor of P.J. O'Rourke, it's the humor of the hip movies of Quentin Tarantino. I happen to find it very repellent, but nevertheless, it is the tone that's in place. Second thing that's happened in the last 50 years, and corollary to what I'm talking about, in terms of the character of the American equestrian class, is the absence of interest in history or politics. One would have expected circa 1950, 1955, even as late as 1960, that the people who enjoyed economic privilege would also be interested in the history of the United States, interested in the intellectual content of the media, of newspapers. I went to work at the New York Herald Tribune in 1960, which was the paper then owned by John A. Whitney, a leading Republican presence in New York and on that wing of the Republican Party. And his ownership of the Tribune at the time was in the line of Pulitzer, who was the Democrat, or Greeley, who was a Republican, or even Colonel McCormick of the Chicago papers, who was extreme, what we would today call extreme right. But Whitney's interest was primarily a political one. He had an idea, he had a political idea. And the ownership of the papers reflected that. They no longer do. I mean, now you would not associate, I would not associate the corporations that own the networks, or that own the Disney company, or whatever the big media syndicates are, with a political idea. I'd associate them with an economic idea, with the new international economic world order, yes, but with an idea that somehow politics mattered, I wouldn't think so. And you can see that in the newspapers this morning. The front page of the Times today talks about the money likely to flow to the Democrat and Republican candidates for the House in next November's election. And clearly the lines are the same lines as Dwayne Andreas, the head of ADM, who gives with the left hand to the Democrat and to the right hand with the Republican, because it really doesn't matter. There is only, in my view, and lots of other people's view, there's only one political party in the United States at the moment. And the point is power. The point is to have connection, to have access to the committee, or to the tax legislation, or to the telecommunications bill. Or it has very little to do with ideas. That is, again, a change, I think, over the last 50 years. You see this on the stage at Yale University. You no longer can study political history, American political history. There are something called cultural studies. So the telling of the American tale has been broken down into telling of the Black American tale, or the feminist American tale, or the ethnic Native American tale, and so forth and so on. And you can go through the entire, you can take, there is no curriculum. That went in the 60s, but in order to satisfy the requirement for late 18th century history of the United States, you can take it in domestic pewter, butter churns, the plight of women on the frontier, and so forth. All interesting subjects, but not a coherent historical view. All right, if I'm correct then in the two points about the American equestrian class over the last 50 years, point one being the feeling of no responsibility toward the less fortunate, and two, the absence of interest in either history or politics as a passionate interest. Then what then becomes the function of the press? And the parallels to me are very similar. When I first started working for the newspaper, my first job was a newspaper reporter for the San Francisco Examiner in 1957, a Hearst newspaper. And I was the only Ivy League person in the entire place. To use the word journalist would have been, nobody used the word journalist. Only Englishmen and fops used the word journalist. Americans used the word reporter or newspaper man. Nobody was paid any money of it to speak of, and nobody expected to make any money. I mean, one did not go into newspaper reporting to become rich. One came in for, probably in my case, romantic ideas growing out of the Depression and out of the autobiographies of novelists on the order of John O'Hara, Ernest Hemingway, but the notion was to somehow get at the truth and tell the story. It's a romantic notion. But there was, and we tended, as newspaper guys, to identify with the people in the bleachers, not with the people in the box seats. And that changed in the middle 60s. By 1967, the ranks of the newspaper, what was the newspaper business, begins to fill up with people from Harvard and Yale and Princeton. The salaries begin to go up to $300,000, $400,000 a year for television personalities. And the identification shifts from the crowd in the bleachers to the swells in the box seats. And I now think that's where we are. I think we now have, by and large, present company accepted, a courtier press. I think of most of the major news persons in the United States, and I think of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Shakespeare's Hamlet. The idea that somebody like Bob Woodward is presented as an investigative journalist is a joke that can only be appreciated by somebody who remembers what investigative journalism was. And I turned down, as the editor of Harper's Magazine, all the President's Men in 73, because there's not a single name source. And I mean, I said, okay, that's gossip stuff, that's great, but that's not what I learned as a journalist. And much of what now passes for big-time journalism is that kind of whisper gossip. The dying Bill Casey imparts in my shell-like ear the truth about Iran-Contra, et cetera, et cetera. Or in Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, not a single name source. Conversations all invented and reconstructed. It passes in a world that doesn't care about history as truth, or as entertainment. And I don't have to dwell on all of that. I mean, but as in 1960, there was still something called the newspaper business, literature, theater, movies. By 1970, all of those what were once discrete disciplines have been fused into something called media. We, as the politicians become less responsible and light-minded, so do our journalists. So does our journalism. I mean, to go back to the Roman example, when at the zenith of Rome's military power, the returning general would have a triumph through the streets of Rome, standing in a chariot, and behind him would come the train of captured slaves and elephants and trophies and so forth. But they would stand behind his shoulder in the chariot. They would stand behind his shoulder. There would be a man who would say, "Remember, you are mortal." Today, our journalists, we are now at the zenith of our economic power. The wonder of an admiring world in many different ways. And we ride in triumph through the streets of New York or Washington or London, and our media stands behind us in the chariot and says, "Know that you are a god." And that's essentially that's the cover of Fortune magazine, or the worship of Bill Gates. And so it's a very dangerous attitude, I think. I think we have a less and less grasp of reality. We now have a country in which the ratio between what the CEO of a corporation makes and the lowest paid assembly worker or clerk in the same company, the ratio is 184 to 1. And even as recently as 20 years ago, the ratio was 15 to 1, which is what it is in France, England, and Japan. And that kind of, I've run out of time. I'm sorry, I've gone too long. But given that kind of world of wish, reverie, dream, the public relations man who's sometimes difficult to tell from the Washington columnist standing behind you in the chariot and whispering in your ear that you're a god, given that, I can't think of a more necessary corrective than both the art and craft of journalism. And I'm proud to be associated with people who also believe that, and with the 6 young people who I hope will sharpen their pencils and go out and do battle in the coming days. Thank you.
We have just a moment or two for a question. I'd be interested in, it seems that the American embrace of a global economy and all these things you've talked about have created critics of the system from Buchanan on the right, but also for other voices on other ends of the political spectrum. And what does that mean? Why is that happening?
You mean, why are there criticisms?
Well, no, why would it be that from a liberal perspective, there is criticism, and also, as well as from a populist or right-wing perspective? There seems to be pretty broad condemnation of that.
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of ways of breaking that down. I mean, there are complaints about everything. I mean, one of the complaints is that the government is not us, however we define the us. It is a them and not a we. And so we go around, we play the game of musical chairs as to who is the us and to who is the them. And I can't possibly answer that question in all of its, but everybody's angry because people on both the left and the right see that the system, that something's wrong. We have a Congress so futile that it cannot negotiate a disarmament treaty with its own citizens who own 200 million guns. Or we have a budget debate. The government shuts down twice in this winter on what essentially is, I mean, a balanced budget is an imaginary number. Utterly, I mean, it happens in the out years, 7 years from now, which of course never happens. It's Peter Pan. We are talking about angels dancing on the heads of pins when we're talking about what the budget is going to be like 7 years from now, and the government shuts down twice. And people get angry at that sort of thing. Every poll shows 80% of the American people want to protect the environment. And the people in Washington just wave that one away. That, they just go right over that one and begin taking down the environmental regulations with no reference to the supposedly, nominally sovereign people. And the nominally sovereign people are getting very angry, properly so, in my view.
Any other, well, thank you very much for coming.
You're welcome.
American Perspectives continues in a minute with Marilyn Quayle speaking on women in the Republican Party. First, a few program notes. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. on Book Notes, columnist and commentator Clarence Page discusses his recent book,